as a speaker or as the leader of a meeting to the speaker or the leader of the meeting to avoid interruptions? What is something that we could do with that? What do you think?
How about we can use some gestures, body languages?
Yeah, gestures,
Yes.
body
Yeah.
language.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's a good one. Using gestures or body language. Yeah. And then what about Sarita, you raised your hand. What's an idea that you have?
We can ask the listeners to turn off the cell phone uh, before the meeting starts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that will help us avoid some of those interruptions that maybe aren't even someone asking a question or saying anything, just interruptions to our meeting from electronics and noises and that type of thing. Very good. Now, there is something that we talked about toward the end of the, or the beginning, I'm sorry, the beginning of the summer. And so let's just look at this. So I always think that one thing that we should consider when looking into this is because interruptions are sometimes necessary, but we also know that we can minimize interruptions in our meeting. So we need to set expectations in advance or at the beginning of our meeting. So, one way that we learned to do this earlier this summer was to, at the beginning of our meeting, tell people when we would like them to ask questions. So, this will be particularly helpful if someone has questions to clarify something or has questions to better understand a topic. If we tell them beforehand when we want them to ask questions, they'll know to maybe write down their question or to hold it until you open up the floor for questions. And so before you start to share your ideas, tell your listeners that you'd like to finish speaking before they add their ideas or ask questions. So, some of the things that we do, and these are just some of the ways that we can do that, some examples. And so, one thing that we could say would be, I definitely like to hear your thoughts today, but but first, I'd like to lay out my idea. Sorry about that. But before I do, but before I do is what I wanted to put. But before I do, first I'd like to lay out my idea. And so this is a way just to tell people that you want to give them all of the information or you want to finish speaking about the topic before they add any thoughts or ask questions. So this is one way you can do that. Another is I think our discussion today will be much more productive if I can get my thoughts out first, and then we can open it up for questions and comments. So, this is just another way to basically say the same thing. You want to make sure that you cover and get out your full thought and your full idea before you open up the floor to comments and questions. And then, lastly, just another example. Um, this may take a few minutes as I'm still organizing my thoughts, but I'd like to share. Now, this example is one that you could use, especially in a meeting that's more about discussing ideas, so like a brainstorming meeting or something where maybe you want to discuss a plan, an idea, a thought that you're still thinking through or that you're still organizing in your head. And maybe that's the purpose of this meeting is to brainstorm or get more ideas out there. So this is a phrase that you can use just to let people know that you may pause a little longer between some of your words or between some of your thoughts. It may take you a second to gather a thought or finish a thought, but you would like to just get through it first before having questions. And so these are ways that we can at least begin to minimize our interruptions. Because again, interruptions are necessary sometimes, but if we can give some details up front before we really get into the details of our meeting, then this is a way that we can hopefully minimize some of those interruptions. Okay? Any questions so far? Just about kind of a review of why we're interrupted or how we can go about minimizing or avoiding some interruptions. Okay, so let's continue. So now I'd like to get into the heart of what we will talk about today, and that is once the interruptions happen, what do we do? Once someone has asked us, maybe they've done it in a polite way, excuse me, I have a quick question, or I'm sorry to interrupt, but so maybe they've done it in a way that is like we learned last week, ways that we should interrupt. And so maybe they've done that. Or maybe it is a situation where someone is being rude. And so we'll learn what we can do about both of those. Okay, so phrases for addressing interruptions will work to describe the following. So how we can continue if we're interrupted, how we can respond gracefully to enthusiastic interruptions. So these are the ones that maybe someone has an emotion or wants to agree with you or wants to tell you that, oh, that's a great idea. These are the ones that are usually they're interruptions, but they're not meant in any way to be harmful or rude. They're actually kind of a sign of support or a sign of agreement. And then we'll also talk about how to handle impolite or aggressive interruptions. So here on the side, we can see that we have four different options. So we can discuss either to keep talking, we can clarify and continue, we can acknowledge the value of what someone has said in their interruption or the reason why they're interrupting. Or in some cases, when we need to handle an impolite or aggressive interruption, we can address it directly. And then, of course, no matter what we do in any of these four options, we need to return to our topic. We, of course, need to get back on track. So once we handle the interruption, how do we seamlessly transition back to our original thought process or our original focus of what we were talking about? How do we transition back? So let's start with number one. Option number one, to keep talking. Okay, so this is the one that is a way that's sort of what Vicky was talking about in the beginning, but we can use a simple hand gesture like putting up our palm, and we can just say, I'm just about finished. Let me just finish this thought, or even just say one moment. So these are some examples of ways that if maybe we are not going to address an interruption immediately, maybe we want to finish what we're saying, or maybe we've told our audience at the beginning of the meeting, please, I'll give you time at the end of each section for questions. And these would be phrases that we could use if we don't want to stop what we're saying and we want to keep going. These are ways that we can adjust that. And so simply a simple hand gesture. And by a hand gesture, we want to make sure that we do this in a way that's polite. We're not going to one moment and just and push our hands out into someone's face. So that's not what we want to do. So we want to still maintain our tone in the meeting, and we can just simply say, "Oh, one moment, let me just finish this thought." And that's as simple as that. We don't really have to do much more. And typically that will get someone to they'll know that now you've acknowledged that they have a question, so you didn't just keep talking and never even acknowledge that they had a concern or an issue, but it also tells them that to wait, that you need to finish what you're talking about first and then you will address it. Okay, So again, these are ways that we can keep talking if we don't want to address an interruption at the very moment. All right? Okay. So now let's get into option 2. So option 2 are things that we can say if someone asks for clarification. So these are things that if someone is seeking to get better understanding about something, maybe they don't understand what you've said, or they need some more information to fully understand what you said, these are the phrases that we can use in that situation. Now, it's very important in both the last situation when we tell someone to hold on, we just want to finish our thought. And of course, in these situations where someone has a point of clarification or something they don't understand, we want to make sure that we definitely address those. So in the example before, where we were talking about how we can keep talking, make sure that you do go back and address that comment, because that will give you more credibility in your meeting. Because if you tell me to wait one moment, just let me finish this thought, and then you never come back to me, the next time I interrupt, that person may interrupt in a more aggressive or more rude way, because now they feel like, well, I tried to ask this and you told me one moment, but then you never came back to me. So the next time I have a question, it may cause them to then ask in a more aggressive manner. And we want to try to prevent that. And also, as the leader of a meeting, we want to make sure that our audience understands what we're talking about. We want to make sure that what we're saying is clear and that people have understood it. So, here are some ways that we can do that. Let's look at these examples. Okay. So, no problem. Go ahead. So remember, these are all ways that we can address an interruption if we are going to let someone interrupt. So let's say someone said, sorry to interrupt, but I have a quick question. You could say, oh, no problem, go ahead. So that's allowing them, that's asking them to go ahead and with their question. Maybe someone just said, oh, sorry, may I interrupt for one moment? Maybe you'll say, sure. Do you have a question? Or you could say, sure. What's your question? Okay. We could also say, that's all right. What is it that you need? So if someone says, oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt, then you could say, that's all right. What is it that you need? What do you need? Is it a clarification? Is it a point that you want to make? So we're okaying them to continue speaking, to continue their interruption. Now, in our left column, these are ways that we will initially handle the interruption. There are ways that we will begin to talk to the person and let them ask their question. Now, once they have asked a question, one thing that you really need to do is to make sure that you explained what you explained what they need clarification about, that you explained it enough and fully for them to understand. So on the right side, in our right column, I have a couple of phrases here that you would want to say after you address their clarification point. So let's say someone has a question. You've said, no problem, go ahead. They ask their question. And then after the question, you go ahead and explain or answer their question. After your explanation or after you give them the answer, you could just ask, did I answer your question? And they could say yes, no, or almost, I'm still a little bit confused about this particular part. And then you could continue your explanation. You could also just say, does that help? Especially if it's something like, oh, I just didn't get this one part. And then you kind of explain it a little bit more. Then you could say, does that help? And then wait for them to tell you if that helped them, or maybe they are still having some issues with what you said. So again, these phrases, left side column, are really good for what you could say to welcome someone's interruption, to let them speak when you to interrupt you, and then the right side are definitely what we want to say just to make sure that our additional clarification or our additional explanation has been received and understood. All right. Are these pretty clear? How any questions here about when we would use these or how we could use these? All right. Let's keep rolling then. Okay. Our next option is to acknowledge value. And so when we acknowledge the value of an interruption, it's that the person may have valuable insights or comments, but you still want to finish what you're saying. And so these these phrases, and then there's a few more that we'll get to, but these phrases are really good in situations where someone interrupts and they say what they want to say when they first interrupt you. So if we think back to last week, there were times when we would interrupt and we would wait to be allowed to continue. Like, oh, may I interrupt for a moment? And there were some times where we may wait for the speaker to say, sure, go ahead. And we also remember there were times when we would just say our phrase to interrupt and we would continue with our thought. So we may say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really loved what you said on that last point. So that's an example of where we interrupt, but we don't wait for permission. We say our sorry to interrupt and we continue talking. And so these responses that we're going to take a look at work best when someone interrupts you in that fashion. When they interrupt you, but they continue saying what they're interrupting about. So if someone says, pardon me, but I really don't understand, or pardon me, but I think I have a better idea of how to solve this issue. These are ways if they continue what they're saying. So let's take a look at these first three. All right. So, oh, that's a great point. Let's come back to that in just a moment, but I want to finish my thought. So, an easy way to acknowledge that they have a good point, that what they've said is valuable, but that you just want to finish what you're saying first. You could say something like, I'd like to hear more about that. Give me just a moment to finish what I was saying. Or another way we could say is, that's an interesting thought. Hold on to it, but before I lose my train of thought, I want to finish what I was saying. So hold on to it. When we say hold on to it, that's just another way to say don't forget. So we're telling someone that's an interesting thought. Don't forget it. Keep it up here, and we're going to talk about that right after I'm finished. So again, we are acknowledging that someone has something valuable to say, but we're going to continue what we were saying. Okay. So let's just take a look at a few more examples. Okay. Let's come back to that. I want to hear more about that afterward. I'm curious about your experience. Let's return to that in a minute. I don't want to forget to talk about that. Let me just finish what I was saying. We're going to talk about that next. Or, sure thing, I want to talk about that too. So again, these are all ways that we are acknowledging that someone has something valuable to say, but we are going to continue our thoughts first. All right. So before I move on, because this one is a little bit tricky, I think. Does everyone understand the when we would use some of these phrases, because it's definitely a particular type of interruption. Usually, these are when someone interrupts with a comment, not necessarily a question. So if someone has something to add and they just want to add a point or add some information, maybe these are the phrases that we can use in that situation. These and the three previous to this to the screen. If someone has an actual question or they need something clarified, then we would want to use those phrases that we talked about before. Those would be the better phrases to use. So we kind of have two that we're working with here. If someone's asking a question for clarification or understanding, or if someone is just adding a comment, information, that we just want to acknowledge their comment and keep moving. Any questions about this section? Yep, go ahead, Sarita.
Is it informal to say, I am curious about your experience? And we will talk about that after a few minutes.
Is that informal? No, that's not informal. So, for all of these phrases here, they really are pretty neutral in their formality. These are all phrases that you could use in both a very formal meeting or out. And because when we say that we're curious, so you're talking about this one here. I'm curious about your experience. Let's return to that in a minute. This is actually a way that we're telling someone, "Oh, I like your comment. I want to know more about what you just said, but let me just finish what I was saying first." And definitely, I think what you have to kind of, with all of these fielding interruptions, the piece that really goes into your formality, I think, is whether or not you would take an interruption and address it immediately, or whether you want to tell someone to hold on and finish your train of thought. So I would say that with that particular phrase, I'm curious about your experience, it doesn't really have a level of formality. It's pretty neutral. But where you might come into a something to think about is if you're in a very formal meeting where you're talking, especially potentially to, maybe you're at a work meeting where you're talking to people who are your superior at your place of employment. So maybe it's your boss, or maybe it's like the regional manager. So maybe it's your boss's boss, or someone who's very high up in authority. That may be a time where you wouldn't necessarily tell them to, "Oh, stop for a minute, I'm going to finish what I'm saying first." You may just accept their interruption and address it at that moment. And so I think that that's where formality comes into play. Not necessarily that these phrases are either more or less formal, but the fact of telling someone to, "Please hold on a moment, let me finish my train of thought," that might be where you either choose not to have them wait to address their comment and just let them say what they need to say and address it right on the spot. And so I think that a lot of that has to do with who you're speaking with and who you're talking to. And I think it also varies on the level of respect that you want to pay to that person. Because even in a very formal meeting environment, as the speaker of the meeting, that automatically puts you at a little bit of a higher level than the participants. You're the leader of the meeting. You're the speaker. So you control the meeting. because when you're speaking, you control the meeting. Even if maybe someone else is leading the meeting and they've invited you to speak, when you are speaking, you are in control of the meeting. And so all of these phrases, whether in a formal or informal meeting, you have the right to use these phrases because as the speaker, I control when I'm going to be interrupted and I accept that interruption and I address it at the moment, or if I need to finish what I'm saying and then come back to what your thoughts were. And so that's something that you as the speaker control just by nature of speaking at a meeting. You control that. But of course, if you need to show a high level of respect to someone, then you may choose to, I'm just going to let this person interrupt me and I'm going to listen to and address whatever they say at the time that they say it. Okay. Did that answer your question, Sarita?
Yes, but I would like to know before we say, I'm curious about your experience. Shall we say, sorry to interrupt you first, and then continue to say, I'm curious about your experience?
Good.
Should the speaker begin with the sentence, sorry to interrupt you, or excuse me, or should the speaker just say, I'm curious about your experience? Let's return to that in a minute.
Okay. Let's let's talk about that. That's a good question. So these phrases are what we are using to respond to an interruption. And so whenever we use any of these phrases, we don't have to say sorry to interrupt because we're the ones who have been interrupted. And so it would go kind of like this. Let's role play or let's give an example of a situation. So let's say that I'm this is a meeting that we're having and I'm having this meeting on how to have a meeting. Okay? And so I'm talking and let's just say you wanted to give a comment. So, you instead of raising your hand so nicely like you did, you just unmuted yourself and you said, sorry to interrupt, but I've been to a lot of meetings where this doesn't work. So now, me, as the speaker, I might say, Sarita, I'm curious about your experiences. Let's return to that in just a minute. And then I could continue what I'm saying. So I don't need to tell you sorry to interrupt because you interrupted me. So I'm just the one who is responding to your interruption. Does that make sense?
Yes, but if you ask the listeners to give comment, and one of the listeners give a very long comment, how should the speaker respond?
Oh, great question. So this is almost we need to interrupt the interrupter. And so actually, and oh no, actually, what I'm going to say is, I'm sorry. So in that particular instance, in the scenario that you're describing, you've now asked for comments. And so you've essentially handed over your microphone, your speaker mic to someone else. And now they are now the speaker. And so you're correct. Once they become the speaker, because you have welcomed them to give a comment, now you are the interrupter. So now you are the interrupter. And in that case, we need to go back to our rules of interrupting and how we interrupt. And so yes, you would want to say, so sorry to interrupt you, but we're running a little bit short on time and we have some other topics to get to. Can we come back to your comments at the end? Something like that. So you are correct. If that's the case where you've invited people to speak and you've invited people to give their comments and you need to cut them off or you need to stop like, "Oh no, this is you're going too far or you're going way off topic maybe." Then that's when you could say, sorry to interrupt you, but can we your this topic might be a little bit better for after the meeting. Let's take this. Let's all talk to you after the meeting or something along those lines. But we would want to say then sorry to interrupt or pardon me or excuse me. Some of those phrases that we learned in our previous in the previous class.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, that was a good question. And also, this is a good example of why we want to make sure that when we do get a question for clarification or understanding, that we validate that we've answered the question and we ask, did that answer your question or is that clear? Because in this case, Sarita was thinking of sort of a different scenario. And so what I was saying didn't quite match up to her exact scenario. And had I just moved on and said my response, okay, well, that's good, then her question would not have actually been fully addressed. And so that's an example there of why it's so important to make sure once you clarify something that that actually does answer the person's question. Yeah. Okay. So moving on, good questions there. Good questions. Okay, so let's go on to option number 4, which we hope we never have to do. But if we are interrupted or in a rude way, and someone is really, they haven't told us, sorry for interrupting, or pardon me, excuse me. They haven't done all of those nice, polite things that we learned about when interrupting. These are some things that we can say to continue speaking or to kind of address that we've been interrupted in a rude way and then keep moving. So the first set, this set here, are going to be the lighter or at least a little softer. They're the softer ways to address someone who has been rude or who has interrupted us in a rude way. So just a few even just a few examples here. So something like, sorry, it takes me a little longer to formulate my thoughts. Let me finish first. And so if you remember that situation at the beginning of class where I said maybe it's a brainstorming meeting and you're developing your thoughts at the same time that we're speaking and we're discussing this issue. Sometimes as we're thinking through things, it takes us a little longer to put all the pieces of our thoughts together. And so this is a phrase that you could use if you just need to finish your thought. The next one, I just want to make sure you hear the full story before addressing your concern. Or I just want to make sure I give you the full picture. So we could say the full story, the full picture. These are ways to just say, I want to give you all of the information first before you give me your concerns or I address your concerns. I'm not quite finished yet is one that we can be a little more direct and keep speaking. Oh, I'm not quite finished yet. Another one. Would you mind if I finish what I was saying before getting to your comment? And in this case, I've put it as a question, but you don't need to wait for a response here, or you can wait for a small response, but if nothing is said at that moment, if the person doesn't actually say yes, or that would be okay, then just continue speaking. The response is implied if the person doesn't continue talking. Or lastly, is it okay if we continue to my story or explanation or with my story or explanation? And this is just kind of like if someone interrupts you in a rude way and keeps talking, then we could say, oh, is it okay if we continue my explanation first or continue what I was saying first? You can say that. Now, if we are in a situation, which hopefully this won't happen, where we need to be more direct, be a little bit harder or harsher with our interruption. So let's say someone very rudely interrupts us. Then these are some other phrases that we can use to address that. I'm not quite finished. Just a moment, please. Excuse me, I was speaking. Hold on just a moment. I wasn't finished speaking. One moment. Let me finish. Now, this next one is actually a very nice way to speak with someone, but what makes it more direct is because I say insert name here. So, this is a way that you can very specifically call out or address someone specifically who's maybe interrupted you, or maybe they've interrupted you on a few different occasions and it's becoming rude and not letting you continue your meeting. I value your comments or I value your input, Vivian, let's say, but could you let me finish my thoughts and then we can have an open conversation? All right? Please let me finish what I was saying. Could I finish my thought? Would you let me finish? And I haven't had a chance to finish what I was saying. So there are a lot of options and variations here that we can use when addressing maybe a rude interruption or someone who really didn't take some of those steps to interrupt at a good place or a good time. Um, these are some ways that we can handle that in a more direct, more stern way, if necessary. All right. Any questions about these and when we would use these? So these are really more so if the person hasn't interrupted you in a very polite way. Both these and the more direct ways, especially the more direct ways. These are really ones that we want to hold for those situations where someone hasn't done it in a polite way. All right. Okay. Now, lastly, we've talked about all of these ways that we can address an interruption. Okay. And so, most of the times, whenever we're addressing an interruption, we're going to need to say something, explain something. But in either way, in all cases, the point is that we need to return to what we were saying in the beginning. So now we've addressed what we've said or what we needed to say. We've addressed their concern, we've addressed their question. Now let's get back. Let's get back to our topic. So here's how we can do that. All right. So some quick ways that we can do that. As I was saying, getting back to what I was saying. Now, the third one, where was I? This is one that you can use if you get off track and you don't remember where you stopped or what you were saying. We all know that happens sometimes. Sometimes we get interrupted and then you're like, oh gosh, oh gosh, what was I saying? I don't even remember what I was saying. That's a phrase where you can say, where was I? Where was I? Um, and sometimes this phrase, if you use it, you can actually use it, and then sometimes you think about it right after you say it, and you can continue. So you could say, "Oh, where was I? Oh, yeah, that's right. I was talking about how we can get back on topic." So you could sometimes you could use it as sort of a rhetorical question where you're not looking for someone to actually answer, but sometimes you do need help. Sometimes we don't remember where we left off. And then we can say continuing where I left off, and also as I was explaining. So these are all very good phrases that we can use anytime we've been interrupted and we need to get back to our original topic. All right. Pretty easy, but those ones, I think that most of you probably have used some of those when you've been speaking before. These are pretty common phrases that we would use. So just to give you a little bit of variation, I think sometimes for a lot of these phrases, and what I hope to do in this is that you don't necessarily need to memorize or know every single example that I've given you either last week or this week. I think the main thing is to give you some variation because most of you are at a level where you know at least one of these phrases. either a sorry to interrupt or a pardon me, excuse me. But what we really want to do here is just kind of expand your options so that every single time you need to interrupt, or even if it's a meeting, every single time someone interrupts you, you don't have to resort to using the exact same phrase. And so this just helps open your options and give you a few more things that you can rely on. So if what I would do to kind of ingrain some of these is just pick maybe two or three from the different categories that you weren't familiar with before, and really think about those and how those are used. Because as long as you know a few different ways to do these things, then that's really going to give you that variation and make it sound a lot more natural when you are addressing interruptions or when you have to interrupt someone. If having those different options. And so that would be my tip for getting through this and the material and kind of learning some extra stuff. I would say thinking about it in that way. All right. So tonight or this morning we only have a couple of minutes left, so we won't get quite to the practice, but never fear because the next 2 weeks, our last 2 weeks of the summer, is it our last two? Is that next week? Yes, I think our last 2 weeks of the summer, we're definitely going to get a lot more practice in. And so this week, for homework, I have uploaded an assignment that is just a quick exercise. There's nothing to turn into me, there's nothing to submit, but it's just a quick exercise on reading a dialogue and picking out some of these phrases and what is meant by some of these phrases. And you're probably going to see some new ones that I didn't give you tonight because there are so many different ways we can address an interruption or we can interrupt other people. These are some of the most common and some of the major ones, but you're going to see in the exercise probably a few different ones. And so you'll just be using context and using the rest of the dialogue to figure out what those phrases mean or what those phrases were intended to mean. Okay, so that's the homework. One thing I will say for next week too is to really take a look at some of these phrases because next week, what I also want to begin doing is really doing some more role playing and practicing. So, what I'm going to be asking of you all is that we're going to kind of have some different topics of discussion and we're going to just have a discussion. And during that, we'll pick different people to play different roles. Someone will be the speaker, someone will be the interrupter that needs to ask a question or say something, and we will look at these different scenarios and practice doing them in real time. So that's what's to come for next week. Okay.
Yeah,
All
when
right.
did you observe your office hour?
I did not. And so so office hours for next week, I think they will be coming out soon.
Tomorrow.
Um,
You
oh
have
my
a
goodness. I am so sorry. Today is still Tuesday evening. I don't know where my mind went. But yes, office hours will be tomorrow, 7 to 8 Central time. And so feel free to stop in there with any questions about teaching ESL. And so feel free to drop in there. Also, this Saturday, we will continue the webinar series about teaching for some of the major online ESL companies. And this Saturday's discussion will be about the classroom. And so, what is teaching like on each of these platforms? What are some of the requirements? What do they like to see? What should you know? So that you can really start to make a decision on if that particular platform fits your teaching style. So that's what we will be talking about on Saturday. And that is at 10 a.m. Central Time, Saturday the 14th.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I will see you next week.
Thank you, Quentin.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.